Hello, hello. Good morning. So I'm Luca Gambazzi. I work for CYSAT, and I will be your host this morning on this stage. So I remember you that everything is recorded and will be available on YouTube after the conference. The slides will also be available to you, so not public. Available on the internet, but you don't need to take pictures on every slides. No, I saw very skilled photographs yesterday. These slides will be available to you, to the participant of the conference after the conference, except that if the speaker asks us to hide everything. But yeah, shouldn't be the case. Okay, let's start then. We have our first speaker, first guest, Ari Kesäniemi. So the family name is difficult. He's the head of security at ReOrbit. Ari has a long experience, more than 20 years in the field of security, and in the last part of his career, he's specializing in space security, and he will give us a talk about threat modeling and management of security risk in satellite startups. So, Ari, stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. And let's get this thing as well. Yeah, good morning to everyone. Hopefully you have coffee and everything. Hey, let me start the presentation. Yeah, here we go. To start, I want to ask a question from you guys. So, do you think it's difficult to find threats for a satellite system? Can you show some hands, like how many think that it's difficult to find? Wow, no one. But I actually agree, it's not that difficult. It's like there's been, like yesterday, talks about vulnerabilities, threats, and risks and whatnot. So it's fairly easy to actually brainstorm a bunch of threats, bunch of risks that you need to consider. But the difficult thing, in my experience, my opinion, is that how do you actually manage those risks? What do you do with those? How do you keep them organized? So that's actually what I'm going to talk about today. So my name is Ari Kesäniemi. I'm working for ReOrbit. I'm leading the security efforts there. But what is ReOrbit? Probably not everyone has heard of us. So we are a company in Finland building satellites. Our main product is GEO SATCOM satellite. So we are selling missions to customers. And security-wise, one of the biggest promises is that the satellites provide sovereign capability to the customer. So obviously security is quite important. So they can actually control the satellite and no one else is going to have access to that. And of course it needs to be cost effective and modular and whatnot. So that brings some challenges. But for that end, of course, we need to know what are the risks and how to deal with those, because you can't have sovereign satellite if it has a lot of vulnerabilities and threats and unmanaged risks. And my background is I've done security for 20 years, and much of that time has been around threats, risks, managing risks, and for the past 4 or 5 years in space security. And I've noticed a few things that don't really work usually if you don't pay attention to those. So some things that I've noticed that hasn't been working for me, or in the risk management and threat modeling side, a consistent level of abstraction for risks, because especially if you brainstorm risk or if you use multiple frameworks or lists, you get like different things, and that's not necessarily bad, but like it's not manageable. Scopes are of course different. If you look at the startup framework. It's like different from some other, and then of course the owners of the risk are different, which is natural, and that's how it needs to be. But you need to consider that not everyone owns those risks. Really important, of course, is to know what is important, like which of the risks are some that you need to deal with first, and which one something that you can take care later, or you don't need to invest as much of money for mitigating them, and how to do that, and especially continue doing that. How do you keep up understanding the residual risk? And generally keeping things updated. So you'll easily get a long list of risks, but how to keep that updated and keeping up what's going on with those, have those changed, what's the mitigation, and so on. So generally control mapping to those risks, that's really important. So you know why we have this particular control in the system or in the organization, what is the risk that it's addressing. And also like, okay, we have this risk, so what are the controls that are mitigating this risk? It's easy to set up, but it's not that easy to actually maintain. Then of course standards and external requirements. Standards usually they list things that you need to do. But if you think about it, they are there because of some reason. There's some risk that they are addressing. And many of the standards are not really talking about what is the risk that actually is being mitigated with this kind of control. The last one, there's a lot of others, but the last in my list is to actually summarizing this and making it understandable for stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders, let's say engineering teams, customers, management, and so on. So you can't just give them all the details of the long threat models and whatnot. You need to make it kind of understandable. Does this resonate with you? Like you can nod or shake your head. Good, yes. I don't know if someone has already solved this completely, but I'm going to talk about like how we are addressing this, and we are small startups, so we have a luxury of like doing things in our way, and like we have I would say one product or two products, but they're like technically quite similar, so we don't have a lot of different customer missions and different technologies, so it's kind of still manageable. So how to make it work? So here are some ideas, and let's have a systematic approach to those. I would like to start with the just mentioning the Cosmos 2 model. I think this was introduced with I think with a different name, but still here in CYSAT a couple of years ago, and it's a ontology of space risks or security management ontology. It has 5 segments, a little bit different segments that you may see, and we are actually using a little bit different segments as well. But the idea is that you have segments, and then you have adversities regarding those for different risks. And then you think of the combination of all of these. So each of the adversities, like a specific adversity, how does it present itself in different segments, in ground segment and user segment and space segment and so on. So we are not using this, and this is not a threat model or risk management model as such, but it gives a good kind of structure for thinking about these things. The segments that we use are, and these I think are pretty common, and you may want to use something that you are using, but the point is to cover the whole, the complete satellite system. So space segment, obviously, that's the satellite in our case. There's the link segment, so ground stations and all those transmissions and connections from ground stations. Ground segment, it's the of course how you control the satellite on ground with the infrastructure. and user segment. So for SATCOM satellite, that's the SATCOM part, so on ground. But really important, of course, is what I call pre-launch segment. So everything that happens before the launch, so manufacturing, assembly, launch, development of software, like how do you actually compile all the software and whatnot, supply chain, that kind of things. Because those inevitably affect the security of the whole system. And that's important to consider. Okay, so how do we actually go about then like analyzing these? So the approach that we have is attack surfaces. And this is probably not really new to you guys, but there's also like multiple ways to approach this. So obviously we need to consider what are the attack surfaces in each of these segments. For each of the segments, we need to decompose the system. For the here's a really tiny picture, and the text in the picture is anyway redacted, so don't worry if you can't read it. This is like overview of our space segment decomposition. There are like physical exposed components in the satellite. Then of course internal components. There are connections and data flows, and then it goes to the kind of OBC stuff, so the onboard computer and what's running inside that. So it's kind of a nested setup, and you need to think about the attack surface in each of the layers. And it's useful to now come back to the ontology and the adversities, and think of the threat actors. And what we are doing is we are thinking of first of all the kinetic and electromagnetic actors and threats, and then cyber threats. There are a little bit different types of threats, so it's maybe easier to keep them a little bit separate. We are actually in the threat modeling, we are not looking into the non-malicious threats, because those have already been like considered in the satellite design, so radiation and that kind of things, and space debris. But of course they are part of the threat model or the risk model, so they need to be considered. But in our case, they were considered already. Then STRIDE is a method that actually works for satellites and of course ground segment and whatnot. So STRIDE, you know, the spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. So that's the Microsoft acronym for finding those threats. Obviously, STRIDE is not completely applicable for physical components, but still there's the confidentiality, availability, integrity concerns that need to be considered. And with this approach, of course, we get things, and what we also do is that we verify what we have listed, that okay, have we missed something using SPATA and ECSSE, ST80C standard, which is the space system security standard, and then other Space Shield, Icarus, and whatnot. So it's good to have like just check that okay, did we consider everything? And the end result is a long list of potential threats, something like this. So there are attack surfaces, there's the categorization, what type of compromise it is, just to double check that did we consider all aspects, and then the threat, in-orbit jamming and whatnot. So okay, this is great, right? Well, it's not really actionable. You just get a map of things that okay, these are the things that we need to deal with, but it's not something that you can really work with. So actually, to get into the risks, we need to compile risk scenarios out of these threats, and the idea is to pick up the threats and make them more concrete, flesh out some details regarding those. To think like who would actually do this, let's say jamming or whatever, and like what kind of jamming we are talking about, or if we think of the software supply chain, like how would that actually happen, and what are the weaknesses that are contributing to that risk. So like what's our software delivery chain? Like are there some manual steps, let's say, that could be weaknesses, and so on. So that's the way to actually dig into specific risks and understand them. And also maybe dismiss that, okay, well, this actually doesn't seem to be a huge concern. We have this figured. The impact, of course, I'm going to come back to this because you can't necessarily know the full impact here, but at least to understand what could happen, where this could lead to regarding the risks. And then it's, of course, good to think when you're thinking how things could happen, the mitigations, what can we do about it? We have a manual step in software supply, software delivery, we automate that or whatever. Or for jamming, we have something else. Or we could have. It's not, at this point, not necessarily a decision that we will do it. But at the end, these risk scenarios are something that you can then start managing as risks much more efficiently than just some list of concerns or threats. Okay, so that's great. And actually, if I just stop talking, then like I think this is like fair end result of doing risk management or risk discovery. But actually, as I listed the things that concern me, what hasn't worked, there are still things that we need to take care of. And if we think of what to do with the risks and those things that we have listed, we have looked into weaknesses, risk, but like to decide what is important, we need to be able to assess those risks. And for that, we really need to understand the business impacts. And we have been actually looking at the product context, what I've been talking about. So this kind of analysis is for our satellite product. But the impact actually, when we want to measure that in terms of money or some other metric, we need to look into the mission context. So where that satellite actually will be used, by who, and which of the risks are applicable and how they actually change when we go into the mission context. So it goes to mission security risk management. And the other aspect that we need to look into is the company context. For ReOrbit, of course, some of these risks have significance directly. It might be just reputation risk that if we are missing some critical security control, it might be something related to supply chain or AIT or that kind of things. So that's also where we can measure the risk better. And here are some examples that for some reason don't show up properly, but nevertheless, these are just some examples. So on the impact side, might be reputation damage, as I mentioned, might be revenue loss. For the customer, it might be that the satellite gets disabled. Obviously, that has some business impact. Or we are missing launch window, which also would be, of course, concern to the company. So those would be the impacts, and you can't really manage those directly necessarily. It's more about managing the risks that will lead to those impacts. And the risks themselves, they of course are dependent on the weaknesses that could be exploited. So there's a kind of chain of things that you need to look into. Some folks actually want to or prefer to do like attack trees and kind of dependencies between risks. It might be useful. It easily gets a little bit too complicated, so we are not doing that, but might be something that works. Okay, a little bit maybe regarding the mission security risks. So you probably get the idea already, but it's important to understand that the missions inherit, of course, the product risks that we have identified, but also the customers' risks. Let's say we are selling our geosatellite to a military organization. They have their own adversaries and they have their own risks. And when we are delivering a satellite to them, of course, we need to be aware. We are we need to manage those risks as well. And so risk assessment needs to be done for each mission. But of course, based on what we already know, what are the things that we need to consider? Some new risks, of course, may be added, new controls, and so on. Maybe the most important thing still is to really define the ownership and responsibilities regarding the risks between the company and the customer and maybe other stakeholders or other organizations. Because then you can assign owners of the risk, you can assign what's going on, who can evaluate what, and the overall security management will then maybe work. Company security risk, this is maybe just typical things that you can do for enterprise. I'm not going to talk about that so much. It's typically about assets that we want to protect, reputation and that kind of things. What is the business value? But of course, looking at the things that we have identified in the product, what of those link to the company risks. And then, of course, you can do your risk management with risk tolerances and whatnot. So that helps to really pick up what are the most important risks, let's say, for AIT to address. Okay, maybe a few words about the controls. We have already, when we were identifying threats and risks, we were identifying also some potential mitigations. But I think it's important to understand that the mitigations themselves are not actionable usually, especially if you take them from standards. You need to really think of what they mean in these contexts. But again, it's still useful to look into, let's say, ISO 27002 or some other standard, secure by design concepts and so on, to make sure, and Sparta has also mitigations with those threats, to look which of these are applicable and how those could apply to our environment. What would be the impact? And from that, of course, it's still important to make those mitigations requirements that are actionable, they are concrete. They might be some security procedures, of course, but they need to be something that you can define clearly and be able to verify, measure that is this actually happening. And then, of course, there's cost involved, but then we go back to the impact assessment, like what makes sense regarding the controls to implement for those risks. Okay, last summary slide about my rambling about the concerns. So we started regarding the threats, so segments and threat actors and attack surfaces, getting those threat list. And then out of that threat list, we can then go into risk scenarios with weaknesses identified and then the mitigation options. But to really do something with those, we will need to look into mission risks, company risks, and then, of course, the security controls and utilizing standards for coming up with the controls, but also, of course, the threats. So I didn't necessarily answer all the concerns I listed in the beginning, but most of the things are actually taken care of when we are doing it in this way. At least so far, it looks it's working. Hopefully, this has gave you some ideas, some thoughts. I'm happy to discuss this and of course, take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Ari, for your presentation. Do we have questions among people here? Yes, I come with the microphone.
Hi, thanks for that. Just one question, number of controls. So in your setup, can you maybe give us some metrics, rough metrics about number of scenarios, number of risks, number of controls you have on your average mission, just to give some numbers?
Numbers of controls. To be honest, I don't have the exact number, but of course, threats and risks, those go in hundreds. the controls as well. It's actually a good question because like some of the controls come from standards, and standards typically have hundreds of controls, but they are overlapping. So there's some mapping to do, and then of course we have our own controls. So we are talking about hundreds, definitely, not thousands, I would say.
Other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that you ran into was the different level of abstractions of certain threats. And I guess you also have different level of abstractions in the attack surfaces. How did you deal with that, and how did you resolve those differences?
Yeah, that's definitely a question, or a problem. For the threat, different level of abstraction, I think this method that I mentioned, like going from threats, weaknesses, and risks, it helps because the confusion sometimes is it's like you're confusing the impact and the kind of a source of that, or the reason for the root cause of that risk. So that this method helps with that. For the kind of level of detail also, like if we do the threat listing at certain level, which is not detailed enough for risk management, that helps. And then to dig in with concrete scenarios. And with controls, it's the same. What standards give you, it's like an idea what you need to do, but like how to do it, it's still up to you mostly.
Thank you.
Are there others? Perfect.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I can't remember if you talked much about the supply chain threats and whereabouts, in what segment would they tend to exist, or would they be across all segments, and what kind of challenges did you have with that?
Yeah, supply chain security and threats, that's like completely separate topic, or like big topic that is included in this. But there's like the physical so component supply chain, there's software supply chain, also services, and there are some frameworks. It's the network of trust, if I recall correctly, that has really good guidance regarding supply chain security. But they are threats in the same way as others, just different sources.
Okay, we have one question online. They're asking which threat modeling tools you're using. You mentioned Stride before. Do you have other tools that you use?
Currently, we are not using any threat modeling tools as such. So it's basically diagramming and then just Excels and that kind of things, just to keep things organized. I've been using threat modeling tools before. They typically like force you to do things in a certain way. With our approach, we could use the Microsoft Stride tool, but I'm not sure if it would be that helpful compared to just diagramming it with Visio or something.
Okay, we have time maybe for a last question if someone has something. If it's not the case, thank you a lot, Ari. Thank you.
Thank you.